Tracks of Terror. This is Narlung, a blink-and-you-miss-it dot tucked into the icy reaches of northern Norway's Arctic Circle. Just a handful of homes huddled around a single rail line, buried deep within the snow-covered boreal forest. On the night of January 9th, 1993, a northbound freight train crawled through the frozen stillness until the driver saw something lying ahead on the tracks. At first, the shape seemed like debris scattered by a storm, but as the engine crept closer, the truth revealed itself in a way so nightmarish, so grotesque, it would haunt the country's forensic archives for decades. As always, while the details in this account are brief and vague, they depict events that are deeply disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. The hamlet of Narlung is the kind of place time forgot. It doesn't appear on tourist maps or even detailed GPS grids. Surrounded by dark forests and shielded from the rest of civilization by mountains and cold, it's barely more than a rail checkpoint for maintenance crews. There are no stores, no signage, no phones, only a few aging houses and the silence of endless snow. And on winter nights, especially in January, that silence becomes absolute. The temperature plummets, frost coils around windows, and by midnight, the wind howls like something alive. At 12:57 a.m. on January 9th, train number 9412, a long-haul fuel and timber freighter, rumbled toward Narlung's frozen crossing. It was operated by veteran engineers Erik and Lasse Gundersen, twin brothers with years of winter rail behind them. They had crossed this stretch dozens of times before, but this run would be their last in more ways than one. As the train neared the outskirts of the station, Erik spotted a mass on the track. The headlights only caught pieces of it. Something sprawling and wrong. He blasted the horn and yanked the emergency brake, but no amount of brake power could stop 80 fully loaded cars sliding over ice. Seconds later, the train struck, and what it hit would become one of the coldest, cruelest puzzles in Scandinavian rail history. Unanswered by dawn. When it finally came to a stop, the Gundersen brothers climbed down with their frost-cracked lanterns and began walking the rails in silence. They'd seen their share of fallen tree limbs and stray elk in these parts, but this was something else, something wrong. What they stumbled upon would unravel everything they thought they understood about their quiet corner of the world. There, scattered grotesquely across the icy steel, were the dismembered remains of 6 individuals, although the full number wasn't clear at first. There was no sound, no movement, just the stark and final stillness of death. The brothers stared down in horror, realizing they weren't just witnesses now. They were tangled in something dark and deeply unnatural. The moment they radioed the dispatcher, emergency services from the larger Kirkenes station were sent racing north. Crews arrived with floodlights, and the frozen village of Aunvika was roused from sleep to help with the grim work of recovering what could be recovered. Names soon followed: Emil, Jonas, Henrik, Mikko, Lars, and Petter. Teenage boys, barely 16, all from Aunvika, friends since childhood. They played ice hockey, hunted in the woods, helped their fathers mend nets, and 2 nights earlier they'd gone out to gather firewood and photograph the aurora. Investigators called it an accident. They claimed the boys lost their way in the forest, missed the last return train, and inexplicably decided to rest directly on the tracks. But 270 meters away, searchers found their backpacks, lined up neatly in a row, untouched and organized. That chilling discovery exploded in the press. A ritual, a pact. Authorities hinted at a deliberate act. But to the families, this was nonsense. These were strong, wilderness-savvy boys with no history of distress, no alcohol in their blood, and no reason to harm themselves. And even if they had laid down, why hadn't a single one of them moved when the 1,200-ton train approached? The engineers themselves said they were placed, not simply lying there. Still, the case was quietly closed. Authorities insisted it was tragic but explainable, but Anvika's grief-stricken families weren't ready to let it rest. Something about this was deeply wrong, and they could feel it. The silence, the unanswered questions, the rushed conclusions, it all stank of something buried. And for the next 2 years they fought, calling, petitioning, demanding, but no one would listen. Records vanished, calls went unanswered, and doors stayed shut. It was clear that someone wanted the case forgotten, but the parents wouldn't stop, not when the truth was still out there. Truth unearthed reluctantly. In the bitter autumn of 1994, the grieving families of Aunvika did something desperate. They wrote directly to the Prime Minister of Norway, appealing for the case of their lost sons to be reopened. By then, the nation's political climate was tense, focused on regional instability and foreign affairs. The odds that their letter would even be seen were nearly non-existent. But somehow, by some twist of fate, it landed on the right desk, and against all expectations, it worked. On November 2nd, 1994, the Ministry of Justice formally reopened the investigation into the Narlung deaths. Two seasoned experts were flown in from Oslo, Inspector Eirik Thorsen and Federal Prosecutor Annika Brodal. These weren't clerks or box checkers. They were respected for taking on the country's most complicated and uncomfortable cases. When they arrived in Narlung, though, time had already erased the traces. Snow had fallen, thawed, and fallen again, burying everything in layers of silence. Worse still, the original investigation had been sloppy, and in some places, deliberately negligent. Thorsen began the hard way, door to door, question by question, but the villagers, most of them cousins or in-laws, claimed to know nothing. They insisted they'd been asleep the night the boys died. But one name kept surfacing, Sten Halvorsen, a reclusive man serving time for stabbing his older brother during an argument. The murder had been written off as drunken rage, but in light of the reopened case, it no longer looked so simple, especially when whispers emerged that the brother, before his death, had drunkenly claimed to know what happened on the tracks. Thorsen visited the prison repeatedly, wearing stain down, until finally, a fractured confession emerged. It wasn't clear at first, stories shifted, facts blurred, but then came the breakthrough. Stan admitted he and his other brother, Leif, had been there that night. That revelation turned everything upside down, and yet something still didn't feel right. Details didn't add up, so Thorsen made a grim request: exhumation. With permission from the families, the graves were opened, and forensic teams re-examined the remains. What they uncovered turned the theory of an accident into a lie. The boys hadn't been killed by the train. They'd been beaten, violently, methodically, with objects that left matching fractures, broken jaws, crushed ribs, repeated trauma to the skulls. Experts then ran simulations using biomannequins and found that the injuries matched only when they used the exact iron tools found in old railway maintenance sheds. This wasn't a mistake. It was a setup. The Suprunenko brothers' account was now undeniable. The bodies had been neatly arranged across the tracks, not scattered. It was deliberate. There was no struggle, no intoxication, no confusion, only the quiet, orchestrated horror of 7 boys placed in death's path and a village that had chosen to forget. Buried beneath silence. Vladimir's working theory had finally solidified. This wasn't an accident, nor a drunken mistake. It was an ambush. The boys were hunted, attacked, and then carefully arranged on the tracks like disposable objects. But the deeper he dug, the stranger it became. Vasily's confession kept shifting. First, it was just him and his brother Yuri. But how could 2 frail men have taken down 7 athletic boys without anyone escaping or fighting back? Then came the pivot. Vasily claimed there had been a 3rd man, Slava, the very brother he'd later murdered. Convenient. since Slava could no longer confirm or deny anything. But Vladimir wasn't buying it. He pressed harder, and during another round of interrogation, Vasily slipped. He named someone else, Nikolai, not just any villager but a senior police lieutenant in Kazinet that very weekend visiting relatives. When Vladimir tracked him down, Nikolai claimed he had already left the village when the deaths occurred. That alibi might have stuck, if not for multiple witnesses who remembered seeing him drinking with Vasily, Yuri, and the local track foreman. As Vladimir followed that thread, another name emerged. Pyotr, the foreman's brother. But Pyotr was no longer alive. He died by apparent suicide shortly after the case was reopened. It was all unraveling. Finally, under intense questioning, the foreman broke. The guilt, the pressure, it all became too much. He told Vladimir everything: the drinking, the arguing, the names, the violence, and finally, the truth. On a quiet night, 2 years earlier, as the sky darkened over Kazinet, a group of men gathered in a small house near the tracks. Vasily, Yuri, the foreman, Pyotr, and Nikolai, the visiting officer. They weren't celebrating anything. They were simply drinking to pass the time. But in Kazinet, boredom was dangerous. As the alcohol dried up, they searched for more and ended up at the station, hoping to find yashas, train cargo handlers who might have contraband or booze to trade. But instead, they found 7 teenage boys standing near the tracks, waiting to catch the late train. Strangers, outsiders, easy targets. The men later claimed the boys were trying to short-circuit the signal system to stop a train, but no wire was ever found, just backpacks and train schedules. The boys had no reason to interfere with anything. They knew exactly when their train was coming, but the men needed an excuse. Tensions rose, words were exchanged, and then came the fatal moment. One boy, maybe trying to de-escalate, stepped forward. Nikolai, emboldened by his badge and his bottle, struck him in the skull with the butt of his service pistol. He died instantly. Shock gripped the others. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then Nikolai barked an order. No witnesses. The others obeyed. Tools were grabbed. Blows were delivered. Some boys tried to run. Nikolai raised his weapon again, threatened to shoot, and they froze in place. What followed was brutal. One by one, the boys were beaten into silence. When the chaos was over, the men dragged the bodies onto the rails. The goal was simple: obliteration by train. They spaced the boys' backpacks nearby to sell a lie that they'd laid down to rest. A tragic, foolish mistake. And when the tracks were cleared of blood and guilt, the men vanished into the forest of silence that had covered Kazinet for years, until now. Justice denied again. By the time the Gunderson brothers stepped off their freight train and began walking the icy tracks with their lanterns raised, the killers were already gone, and the boys were far beyond saving. What lay before them wasn't a tragic accident. It was the final result of something unimaginably cruel. And now, after years of silence, bureaucracy, and denial, the truth had finally clawed its way to the surface. The scene had been staged with precision, bodies aligned perfectly along the rails, backpacks placed like breadcrumbs, and an entire village pretending not to see. It was grotesque, it was cold, and for a while, it looked like no one would ever be held responsible. But when the case finally reached court in the spring of 1998, nearly 9 years after the murders, the entire country of Norway was watching. The courtroom in Tromsø overflowed with reporters, grieving families, and people who had followed the case since the very beginning. For 7 excruciating months, witness after witness took the stand. Forensic experts explained skull fractures and tool marks, and every chilling detail was aired before the nation. Finally, when the verdict was read, it took over an hour to deliver. Nikolai, the police lieutenant who initiated the attack, was sentenced to capital punishment, as were the local foreman and the Halvorsen brothers, Sten and Leif. For the families, it felt like the impossible, had happened. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. But just as the men began waiting in isolation cells for their sentences to be carried out, everything changed. Norway, under growing pressure to align with European human rights laws, initiated reforms that included the abolition of the death penalty. On August 21, 1999, the Supreme Court filed a protest, citing procedural violations and international obligations. And just like that, the sentences were thrown out. The case was overturned, the men released, and in a single moment, almost a decade of investigation was unraveled. No retrial, no continued custody, nothing. What followed was a spiral into something darker. Weeks after his release, Sten Halvorsen was arrested for attacking a cousin who, according to neighbors, had always known more than he let on. Leif Halvorsen, his younger brother and co-defendant, was found dead in his cabin, either from sudden pneumonia or, as others whispered, from being suffocated. Then came the most chilling twist. A retired rail worker named Oddvar Eriksson, who had helped remove the bodies of the boys from the tracks that night and testified in court, was found dead under the wheels of a train at Narlung station. Official reports called it a tragic slip. Locals knew better, as if the horror of that August night had not only remained, but continued to claim. Yet, despite the mounting threats and institutional stonewalling, the parents never gave up. They had lost their sons, their peace, and their faith in the system, but not their voice. In March 2000, after relentless petitioning, the families finally forced the Justice Ministry to reopen the case under the legal clause of unresolved aggravating circumstances. It would take 4 more years, 4 years of exhumations, additional autopsies, more than 120 new witness interviews, and the re-examination of every inch of the original forensic evidence. One name appeared again and again: Nikolai. Since his release, the man who orchestrated the murders had reinvented himself as a civil servant. He'd been elected to a municipal seat in a nearby town, smiled for newspapers, and shook hands with officials. One of the most monstrous participants in the deaths of 7 boys had become a face of the local government. But in October 2004, something remarkable happened. The Supreme Court of Finnmark issued a final ruling. Nikolai, Sten Halvorsen, and the former foreman were again found guilty. This time, the evidence was overwhelming, and the international attention meant the verdicts could not be quietly reversed. Still, to the families, what followed was another blow. Nikolai and the foreman received only 10 years each in a maximum security penal colony. Sten was sentenced to 10 years, for masterminding and participating in one of the most brutal and deliberate murders in recent history. Even worse, Nikolai never stopped appealing. From behind bars, he filed motion after motion, claiming innocence, painting himself as the victim, and calling the case a political witch hunt. Through it all, the families endured. They endured the lies, the dismissals, the released murderers, and the indifference of a system that never truly wanted to listen. But still, they didn't let go. They held vigils. They returned to courtrooms. They spoke to any reporter who would listen. They forced the country, and eventually the world, to acknowledge the truth of what had happened that night in 1989. Not because the system worked, but because they refused to let the story die. And in the end, they were the reason this case was solved. They were the reason the truth didn't stay buried under the snow. Narlung will never be what it once was. The town that remained silent all those years, whether out of fear or complicity, can no longer pretend it didn't know. What happened there is more than a crime. It's a symbol of how far rot can spread when power, silence, and corruption meet. And it's a warning about what happens when justice becomes optional. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I also want to thank all of you who continue to send in these remarkable, tragic, and sometimes unbelievable stories. So many of the cases on this channel exist only because someone, maybe someone like you, refused to forget. If you'd like to submit your own story suggestion, there's a form in the description below. And if you've reached out and I haven't replied, I'm truly sorry. It's been overwhelming lately. But please know your voice matters. And as always, until next time, stay curious, stay safe. And remember, sometimes the truth takes longer to arrive than it ever should.